This brings us to the second building in Vitcover's sequence, Santa Maria Novella in Florence, which to his mind is offering an alternative solution to the problem of what it means to fuse an Italian medieval structure and a classical idiom. Now, Santa Maria Novella was a building originally erected under the auspices not of the Franciscan order as in the Tempio, but of the Dominican order. It was completed around 1360, and the commission came to Alberti a century later from a rich Florentine textile merchant by the name of Giovanni Rucellai. Santa Maria Novella confronted Alberti with a similar set of issues to those he had faced at the Tempio in Rimini. Again, he relied on the ornamental capacities of pilasters and engaged columns, refusing the idea that the column should have a structural function. He also relied on the idea of a cornice projecting over half columns on pedestals at each side of the entrance. He inserted, and this is different from the Tempio, a high attic zone, which separates the lower story from the upper story. One thing we do know is that he had to incorporate that large, round Gothic window. He didn't have any choice about that. And what he did instead was reiterate it in some sense. It gets reiterated by the decorative motif in the triangular pediment, as well as the gigantic scrolls to either side. This, in other words, is actualizing something that he had entertained at Rimini. Now, one of the things that's striking about Santa Maria Novella is that despite its classical forms, we see columns, we see elaborate capitals, it is a church that maintains Tuscan formal traditions. You have multicolored marble incrustations, you have pointed arches, you have even the ornament of the capitals and the scrolls, which all have Florentine prototypes. Now, if you take Vitcover's interpretation of this building, Alberti's goal was to quote-unquote harmonize the medieval facade, to find what he called a mutual accord between the old and the new, between the old structure and the new idea. It's important here also to underscore that Alberti was even more limited than he had been at the Tempio. Not only could he not make an envelope for the entire building, he was really only looking at the facade, but he had to incorporate aspects of the facade that were standing. The aforementioned window, the side entrances under pointed arches, which is as far removed from a classical idiom as you could imagine, the high blind arcades in which the arches are simply part of the wall. He also carried over the original color scheme of the marble incrustation, white panels with green bands, into his own additions. One thing we might want to do is to pay attention to what might be called the kind of civic or patriotic historicism of the facade's stylistic aspect. The pillars at Santa Maria Novella actually refer back to the corners of the 11th century baptistry, which had similar horizontal incrustations. And you might also want to turn to the Romanesque church of San Miniato al Monte, begun in the early 11th century. Its facade is from the 12th century. It's clear that Alberti seems to have been looking at that source as he developed the idea of a two-story disposition for the facade with a pedimented upper level for screening the nave. In this sense, Alberti's design for the facade of Santa Maria Novella is deeply traditional. It's local, it's historiated, and it is patriotically Florentine. This more vernacular aspect is completely uninteresting to Vitcover. He's not interested in recovering those sources and talking about the local and patriotic aspects of the commission. He wants to see something else at work. And this is what he reveals by means, of course, of his diagrams. Now, his argument is that by focusing on the noticeably high attic, separating the lowered register from the upper register, we can see how Alberti actually, quote, overcame, and this is Vitcover, some of the difficulties which had remained unresolved in Rimini, end of quote. So somehow that strong attic zone, that strong horizontal band, for Vitkover is what detracts from the fact that although the inner piers are continued down below by the columns, the outer piers are not, and this might offer the same kind of visual dead end and confrontation between verticality and horizontality that we had at Rimini. By inserting that attic zone, the problem, as it were, disappears. In other words, we have elided the discrepancy between the entrance register and the upper story. And what could have been a pastiche effect becomes patently obvious to what Vitkover calls the quote-unquote classical eye. This needs explanation, and here's Vitkover to do so. Quote, "The attic in Santa Maria Novella is at the same time effective as a horizontal barrier and neutralizes the vertical tendency of the projecting entablature above the columns, the motif which had led to such difficulties in Rimini." In other words, Vitkover sees Alberti as able to offer here at Santa Maria Novella the colossal columns as an ornamental vehicle without the kind of confusion that he ran into at the Tempio. In other words, Santa Maria Novella solves the problem of the Tempio. After focusing on the attic, Vitkover focuses on the complexities of the entrance, framed by those two colossal green columns. Now, like the Tempio in Rimini, you have two pilasters carrying up to an arch, but there's no pediment over the door, as there was at the Tempio. And what instead asserts itself is a much deeper space that lets a highly decorative, ornate entablature course its way back into the recesses of the entrance depth. This not only makes the entrance closer to an antique prototype, in fact, the Pantheon in Rome, but more to the point, and this is again Vitkover's language, it makes the composition quote-unquote tighter somehow, as opposed to vague and floating and surface-oriented in Rimini. This is very noticeable in Vitkover's language, this kind of seeking out of compactness, of legibility, of coherence in this second example, as opposed to Rimini. It's a way to describe in language the kind of developmental terms of Alberti's quest to apply a classical idiom to the facade and seek out tightness and unity in the end result. The other advantage of turning to Santa Maria Novella after Rimini is that it imposes an immaculate chronology. It says that somehow the Tempio in Rimini, you'll remember that the commission dates from about 1450 to 1454, is followed then by Santa Maria Novella, which unfolded as a commission between 1456 and about 1470. Vitkover is allowed to conclude along these lines. Quote, "The entrance to the Tempio is only the first step leading to the fully developed classical composition displayed in that of Santa Maria Novella." So given the allegiance to Tuscan precedences, to Tuscan motifs, to 12th century sources like San Miniato, like the baptistry in Florence, one might be led to ask, what manner of classicism is this beyond entablatures and columns? In other words, is there really a system here? This is where Vitkover's diagram steps in, of course, and where he unveils his explanation of classical harmony. Harmony, the essence of beauty, consists in the relation of the parts to each other and to the whole. And in fact, a single system of proportion permeates the facade, and the pace and size of every single part and detail is fixed and defined by it. Proportions recommended by Alberti are the simple relations of 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and so on, which Alberti had found in classical buildings. The diameter of the Pantheon, for instance, corresponds exactly to its height. Half its diameter corresponds to the height of the substructure, as well as to that of the dome, and so on and so forth. In view of this kind of explanation, in view of this scheme of things, simple ratios, the idea of simple ratios, emerge as the principle dictating the configuration of the facade. So, for example, in that diagram, Vitkover inscribes the entire facade in a square. That rectangle cuts the large square in half, explains the relation of the two stories to each other. The lower story encompasses two of the squares, while the upper centralizes one of them. What this means is a ratio of 1 to 2. In Figure 4, another diagram, the same ratio is shown in the subunits of each of the stories. The central bay of the upper story is a perfect square, whose sides correspond precisely to half the width of the whole story. The whole story can be subdivided into 4 equal squares, 2 corresponding to the pediment and to the entablature, and then 2 to the pilastered wall below. The subdividing continues on, with the smaller 4 squares defined in dashes in Vitkover's diagram, becoming the fundamental module for the attic and the entrance door. And then there are the 1 to 3 ratios. The height of the entrance bay is exactly 1.5 times its width. Furthermore, the small square incrustations of the attic are 1/3 of the attic's height and are related in a ratio of 2 to 1 to the actual diameter of the columns, and so on and so forth. The story of ratios of modules unfolds. And the whole point of this diagrammatic demonstration of Santa Maria Novella's ostensive geometrical harmony is to introduce the conceptual basis of an otherwise stylistically retrograde and confusing or eclectic facade with Tuscan and medieval roots. Here's Vitkover again. The whole facade is geometrically built up of a progressive duplication or, alternatively, a progressing halving of ratios. It is clear that Alberti's theoretical precept that the same proportion be kept throughout the building has here been fulfilled. It is the strict application of an unbroken series of ratios that marks the unmedieval character of this facade and makes it the first great Renaissance example of eurythmia. What is eurythmia in this context? In Greek, eurythmy designates graceful movement or the graceful movement of a well-proportioned object. And we can even turn to the Hellenistic architectural theorist and engineer, Vitruvius, for an explanation of this architectural concept. For Vitruvius, architecture consists actually in 6 fundamental principles. The first is order. The second is arrangement or disposition. The third is eurythmy. The fourth is symmetry, the fifth is decor, and the sixth is distribution. For Vitruvius, eurythmia, quote, depends on the beautiful shape of the building and on the proper appearance achieved by the arrangement of its individual parts. It is achieved when the elements of the work are proportionate in height to width, length to breadth, and every element corresponds in its dimensions to the total symmetries of the whole. Eurythmia, put another way, speaks to the beautiful relation of parts as an architectural principle, as a geometric necessity. So eurythmy is associated with the appearance of visual beauty as opposed to symmetry, which belongs to something more abstract. It is defined as a kind of illusion of grace or the quality of being well-shaped. It signifies an aesthetic sense of wholeness, of an overall coherence of the work. Eurythmy is crucially based on the aesthetic apprehension of a composition in proportional terms. Because of this eurythmy, because of this appearance of the beauty of the ratios in Santa Maria Novella, we come to this conclusion. The Tempio poses the problem of aesthetic apprehension, and Santa Maria Novella solves it.